Chapter 3. The Box That No One Should Open. Detective Inspector Geoffrey Hargreaves was a solid-looking man, with a trimmed moustache, a jacket always a little tighter than necessary, and a well-cultivated aversion to mysteries that smacked of the bizarre. He preferred simple robberies, fights with fatal outcomes, crimes where the evidence lined up like well-trained soldiers. The Forsyte case, on the other hand, was a tangle. He was now in the late Diana Forsyte's private study, an upstairs room that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. There was a window overlooking the back garden, a somewhat threadbare Persian rug, and several bookshelves filled with books on botany, heraldry, and genealogy. A faint rectangular mark of dust remained on an empty mantelpiece by the fireplace. "This is where the box was," Lionel Forsyte confirmed, his voice muffled. His hands were clasped together, his cheeks grey. "Diana said it was confidential, personal. She never let me open it." The inspector looked at Mr. Forsyte wordlessly, assessing whether this sudden grief was genuine or a facade. "Did you know if the box contained documents, jewellery, letters? I don't know. I suspect it was something from her past. Diana came from a rather peculiar family, strong-willed people. She always said there were things that should be buried. Did you have any enemies?" Hargreaves asked bluntly. Lionel blinked, surprised. "Enemies? Well, she was a strong woman. She had opinions, and she shared them. Any recent arguments?" "He argued with Mrs. Danvers last week about a charitable donation, and with the gardener Turner about pruning the bushes, but nothing violent." The inspector said nothing more. He looked down at the empty shelf and then at the floor. A spotless carpet, no visible marks. Someone had taken the box, yes, but there were no signs of a struggle. No fingerprints, no broken glass. Everything was done with almost ceremonial precision. At that moment, one of the officers poked his head around the door. "Sir, Miss Jane Marple is downstairs. She said she didn't want to interfere, but she had something to discuss." Hargreaves sighed. He already knew Miss Marple, of course. Everyone in the region knew her. She had solved more than one mystery simply by looking closely into people's souls, as the locals said in a half-reverent, half-exasperated tone. He found her sitting in the greenhouse next to a ficus tree. She had declined the offer of tea and was busy slowly untwisting a lace glove, as if her fingers were also thinking. "Inspector," he said with a friendly smile, "I'm sorry to interrupt." "You're not interrupting, Miss Marple. What have you noticed?" She bowed her head. "I was wondering if anyone had asked about Mrs. Crabtree, the housekeeper." "Yes. He's been with the Forsytes for 5 years. He wasn't at the party yesterday, which seemed odd to me, since he usually handles catering at events." Hargreaves made a mental note. "Do you know where it is?" "No, but maybe it would be worth paying her a visit. She seemed very upset the last time I saw her a week ago, as if something was eating her up inside." The inspector nodded and prepared to say goodbye, but Miss Marple added something else, as if she hardly remembered it. "And by the way, Inspector, have you noticed that the chandelier wasn't Victorian like the rest of the decor? I'd venture to say it was 18th century. Possibly French." Hargreaves frowned. "How do you know?" Miss Marple smiled softly. I had a suitor in my youth who restored antiques. He talked to me more about candlesticks than love, but I learned some useful things." The inspector couldn't help but make a slight gesture of respect. "I'll keep that in mind." "Thanks." As she left, Miss Marple turned her head slightly toward the garden. A shadow was moving among the hedges. Not a real shadow, but the idea of someone avoiding notice. Someone who knew the house well, its entrances and its secrets. That night, while the townspeople murmured new theories, from an accidental burglar to a Masonic conspiracy, Miss Marple knitted silently in her parlour. Every stitch she made was a hypothesis, every loop a connection. Not everyone at the party had been invited. Not everyone mourning Diana was sincere. And not all the boxes are sealed because of what they contain, but because of what they might reveal. Chapter 4. The Shadow Behind the Hedges. The next morning, the sun pierced the sky as if oblivious to human crimes, and in Little Witham the air was deceptively serene. The church bells rang in the distance, and the smell of damp earth wafted through the carefully tended gardens. But something had changed. The conversations were no longer about rose bushes or lemon recipes. They spoke in whispers, cautiously, in that tone you use when you're afraid the walls can hear you. At the Forsyte house, Inspector Hargreaves returned early. This time he was not greeted with tea or formalities. Lionel Forsyte seemed more deranged than the day before. He had slept little, he confessed, and his replies were more curt, more clumsy. "I don't remember if Diana ever mentioned losing the box," she said, her hands shaking, "only that it was important. That it should be kept sealed. Was it locked? No, it just wasn't supposed to be opened. An old promise, he once said. Something about his family." Hargreaves looked around. The study was still intact, but a poorly closed window had let some dust into the sill. Too fine to leave a trace, but noticeable, enough for those who knew how to look. "Do you have a permanent gardener, Mr. Forsyte?" "Turner. He's been with us for over 10 years. Do you know if he was here on the day of the party?" "Of course." She took care of the garden tables and moving the large flower pots. The inspector nodded slowly. He decided it would be best to talk to Turner in his own environment. He found the man in the garden shed, sharpening a pruning shears with almost artistic patience. He was a robust man, with a weathered face and calloused hands, who seemed more comfortable around plants than people. "Where were you at tea?" Hargreaves asked without preamble. "Near the back hedge," Turner replied without looking up. "There was a bunch of peonies the lady wanted to highlight. She asked me to trim it properly." "Did you see anyone passing by there?" "Many. That shortcut through the hedge is used by all the guests to get to the porch without going through the front. Did you notice anything out of place?" Turner stopped his work. For a moment he hesitated. "Someone? Yes, I saw someone in the bushes. I couldn't say who. It was just a moment, a flash of fabric, maybe grey or brown. They were walking carefully. It wasn't a stroll. It was someone who didn't want to be seen. And you didn't think to warn them. I thought it was a child, or one of the guests looking for privacy. I don't butt in where I'm not wanted, Inspector." The gardener returned to his work. Hargreaves, without further questions, returned to the main entrance, but something stopped him. In a corner of the back hedge he saw a broken branch, almost hidden. He bent down. At the base, half buried in the ground, was a button. Small, mother of pearl, ancient. Meanwhile, at the other end of the village, Miss Marple had decided to visit Mrs. Crabtree, the housekeeper. Her house was a modest building, with vines climbing the porch and a door that creaked when opened. "Ah, Miss Marple," Crabtree murmured, drying his hands on a grey apron. "I wasn't expecting any visitors." "Oh, just an old lady interested in someone else's health," Miss Marple replied in her honeyed voice. "I didn't see you at the party, and I was wondering if you were all right." The woman hesitated. Her face showed signs of sleepless nights. "No, I wasn't feeling well that day. Migraines. I stayed home." Miss Marple watched the shifting eyes, the nervously twitching fingers. Sometimes the body finds excuses when the soul feels uncomfortable. I've seen that happen more times than I can count. Crabtree didn't reply. He simply invited her in, offering her a cup of tea, which Miss Marple gratefully accepted, though with no intention of drinking it. Instead, her eyes travelled around the room. On a dresser she noticed an old photograph. Diana Forsyte, younger, with another woman, with a rounder face and an intense gaze. She looked like a sister, or a friend from her youth. "Who is she?" Miss Marple asked, pointing at the photo. Crabtree hesitated. Then he looked down. That's an old story. Miss Diana and Miss Frances. They were inseparable until they weren't, because a dispute. Over a man, I think. Or worse. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Is Frances still alive?" I don't know. Not for years. She left and never came back. But the box, it was hers. Frances's." Miss Marple nodded gently, like someone who has heard the exact missing note in a melody. "Thank you, Mrs. Crabtree. Your memory, as always, has been most helpful." As he stepped outside, the wind gently ruffled his hat. He had another piece. A box that wasn't meant to be opened. A broken friendship. And a shadow in the hedges moving when it thought it couldn't be seen. Miss Marple and the Candlestick left on the porch. Chapter 1. The Forsyte Porch Party. In the quiet, picturesque village of Little Witham, where geraniums bloomed like burning pins on the windowsills and fir trees lined up with the precision of a military parade, the Forsytes held their traditional August porch tea. It was one of those English village customs that seemed as innocent as the oatcakes they served, but was actually simmering with social observation, hidden pride, and a dash of competition disguised as politeness. The Forsyte family's porch, a cheerful, elegant white wooden gallery lined with flowered pillows and vases of dahlias, was once again the scene of a gathering of the neighbourhood's elite. This time was no different. There was Mrs. Diana Forsyte, plump and regal in her wicker chair, serving tea with the grace of a queen on her throne, and her husband, Lionel, who always seemed halfway between a yawn and an inconsequential anecdote about his time in Calcutta. 2. Conversation revolved around safe topics: the weather, the health of Mrs. Drayton's camellias, and the peculiar visitors young Reverend Milton had been receiving lately. Everyone knew it meant that a young stranger had been seen entering and leaving the vicarage with suspicious frequency. But that wasn't the kind of scandal that was coming. In the middle of the afternoon, just as the second cups were being poured, Mrs. Caroline Danvers, a widow with a sharp voice and a perpetual hat, rose to take a breath. She was the one who saw him. On the side porch, away from the tea area, Someone had left an antique, blackened silver candelabra with 3 curved arms and unlit candles. It didn't seem to belong to the house, and its presence was as incongruous as a funeral note at a children's party. "Lionel!" Mrs. Danvers exclaimed, her voice nasal like an old-fashioned bicycle horn. "Did you leave this here as part of some themed decoration?" Lionel approached, frowning. "No, it's not ours. How strange. Where did it come from?" Mrs. Forsyte stood up with difficulty, followed by a collective murmur of bowed heads and whispers. The conversation died away like a candle in the night wind. "Couldn't it be from the church?" Mrs. Drayton ventured, already relishing the thought of something sacred having been desecrated. "Or some antique shop," added Mr. Webb, who worked part-time in the bookstore and part-time making up rumours. Amid the silent commotion, a slim figure, wearing a straw hat and lace gloves, watched intently from her chair at the side of the porch. Jane Marple hadn't spoken a word, but her eyes, small, bright blue, were fixed on the object with an intensity that went unnoticed by most. For others, it was simply an out-of-place candlestick. For Miss Marple, it was a social anomaly. Who would leave such a heavy object unannounced on a porch? Why a candlestick and not a note? And why at a party where everyone would see it? That same evening, as the neighbours returned home, excitedly discussing the mystery of the candelabra, the Forsyte house remained empty and silent until, just before 10 o'clock, a piercing scream cut through the stillness like a knife. "Diana! Diana is dead!" It was Lionel Forsyte who screamed. He ran downstairs in his bathrobe and slippers, staggering to the door, where a neighbour, still walking back, became an involuntary witness to the horror. Diana Forsyte lay on the floor of her living room, her neck tilted unnaturally. There were no signs of forced entry, nor of a struggle. Only the candlestick, the same candlestick left on the porch, was missing. Miss Marple, at home a few houses away, laid her sewing book on the table and stood up calmly. "I knew something wasn't right," he murmured. And so the mystery began, not with a gun, not with a written threat, but with an antique candlestick left on the porch of a party. Chapter 2. The Murmur in the Bakery. The next morning, little Wytham didn't wake up to the song of blackbirds or the aroma of freshly baked bread. It woke up to a murmur, one that slipped through the corners like an unwanted breeze, snaking between wicker baskets and half-open windows. Diana Forsyte had been murdered, and the town, which had long prided itself on being an island of tranquillity in an increasingly chaotic world, now resembled a pond where someone had thrown a stone. Ripples could be felt everywhere. At the Crumble Bakery, a tiny shop with wooden shelves that always smelled of yeast and cinnamon, the whispers started before the first batch of buns came out. Mrs. Hartley, her knitted hat askew, spoke without even bothering to lower her voice. "A candelabra, imagine! Who brings a candelabra to a party and then disappears with it?" "Maybe it was the gun," whispered Miss Elspeth, the retired teacher, still rummaging through her bag for her purse. "Something that heavy. It could break anyone's neck." "And why Diana?" asked the baker, the young and always curious Millie Crumble. "I mean, she was bossy, yes, but she didn't mess with anyone. Or did she?" Answers weren't necessary. The awkward silence that followed was enough. Everyone knew Diana Forsyte was many things, proud, nosy, with a needle-sharp tongue, but she was also generous with charities, and she never forgot a birthday. Miss Marple, waiting patiently in line with a linen basket on her arm, raised an imperceptible eyebrow at the last remark. "Sometimes," he said, as if addressing the bun, in front of him, overly general compliments are the most elegant way to hide deep resentments. The other women fell silent. Milly, who had grown up hearing Miss Marple's observations spoken of as if they were oracular predictions, felt a slight chill. "Do you think someone from the village?" she began to ask, but the old woman interrupted her with a serene smile. "In my experience, my dear, the most violent crimes rarely come from strangers. Human emotions, jealousy, pride, shame, tend to thrive where there's familiarity." Before anyone could respond, young John Cresswell, apprentice to the local sergeant, hurried in. His face was red, and his shoes were soaked with dew. "The inspector was just on his way from market chipping," he announced between gasps. "He's already at the Forsytes' house. He said no one is to approach without permission. And it seems there's something else missing." "What thing?" Elspeth asked. John lowered his voice, almost enjoying the drama. "A box. Small, dark wood. According to Mr. Forsyte, it was on a mantelpiece by the fireplace. Mrs. Forsyte guarded it like gold." Miss Marple pressed her lips together slightly. "And no one knows what it contained?" "I have no idea. Lionel says they never allowed him to open it. It was Diana's only. That was enough to send the conversation into a whirlwind. A mysterious box, a missing candlestick, a death with no witnesses. It was as if Poirot himself had come to play a guessing game." But as the voices rose, Miss Marple withdrew silently. Carrying her basket over her arm, she walked slowly down the main street, nodding to the neighbours who looked at her with respect and, in some cases, with a certain discomfort. He passed the tailor's window, where the mannequin was still wearing the linen jacket no one had bought in 3 summers. As he turned the corner, he looked toward the Forsyte house, which now looked less like an elegant residence and more like the scene of a tragedy. The curtains were drawn, and there was an officer at the entrance. Everything was on pause, as if time itself had held its breath. Miss Marple stopped in front of a neatly trimmed hedge. She stroked a leaf with her fingers and murmured, "A box that couldn't be opened, a candlestick that appeared and disappeared, and a woman with more enemies than she admitted to having friends." And then he remembered something, a random remark Mrs. Danvers had made at the party. "She doesn't let anyone go up to the study, not even Lionel. She says she needs her space too. Think, a private space, a place Diana jealously guarded. If someone had wanted to find something or steal something important, they would have had to sneak in unnoticed, or perhaps hide in broad daylight among the party crowd." Miss Marple continued on her way calmly, like someone going to pick up a prescription or visit a niece, but inside the pieces were already beginning to turn. It wasn't the evidence that would solve this crime. It was the subtle logic of human behaviour, wounded pride, and the secrets that small towns bury beneath their flower gardens. Chapter 5. The Man Nobody Mentioned. In towns like Little Witham, names take on a life of their own. Some are repeated with pride, the Mildreds, the Cresswells, the Danvers, while others disappear from conversation as if they had never existed. These names, the forgotten ones, often have a story behind them that no one wants to tell, and Miss Marple, as a keen observer of what is said and what is left unsaid, knew that the truth is often hidden right there. In the silences, that morning, sitting on the bench by the war memorial, Miss Marple watched the people with that peaceful air that made her invisible. Mr. Elroy was cleaning the glass of his watch shop. Mrs. Danvers was scolding her dog for the third time in less than a minute. The Giles twins were running with kites along the dirt road. Everything seemed in order. Everything except what wasn't mentioned. When she saw the young Reverend Milton pass by, Miss Marple rose gently and greeted him with a courteous gesture. He was a well-intentioned, if somewhat absent-minded man, and above all talkative if given the right pretext. "Reverend," she said, "excuse me for taking up a minute of your time. I was wondering if you remembered a certain young lady, Frances Ashcombe, I think her last name was." The young man blinked. Ashcombe. Wow, I haven't heard that name in years. He used to live on this very street right where the dentist's office is now. Why do you ask? Curiosity, simply. Frances was complicated, so they say. There was a scandal in her youth, although no one talks about it openly. I think she left shortly before the war, and before that, any connection with the Forsyte family. Oh yes, she and Diana were inseparable until something happened. My predecessor once said that there was a man in the middle, but he never went into details. Just a matter of youth. Miss Marple nodded serenely. Thank you, Reverend. What a clear memory you have for someone so young. The young man smiled, slightly blushing, and walked away. Miss Marple remained on the bench for a few more seconds, letting her thoughts settle. There was a figure still unmentioned, a he who had no name, an absent person who seemed to be at the centre of the old dispute. Back at home, Miss Marple consulted her modest personal file. It was a collection of notes, clipped obituaries, parish registers, and small details neatly stored. She found what she was looking for in an edition of Witham Courier 1927. Engagement announced between Diana Fairley and Charles Everley of Linton House. Charles Everley, a lost name. And yet, something about that surname made him frown. Later, as evening fell, she walked firmly to the municipal library. There, among the civil records, she confirmed what she suspected. Charles Everley had disappeared, under mysterious circumstances, a few months before the announced wedding. There was no marriage. There was no explanation, just a gap in the archives that spoke louder than any official note. On his way back, he passed the tailor's shop, where Mr. Webb was serving with his usual air of local superiority. Mr. Webb, you who know so much about everyone, do you remember a certain Charles Everley? Webb flinched as if he'd been told a forbidden word. Everley? From Linton House? Of course. But no one's mentioned it in decades. Why's that? Because it's not convenient. He disappeared overnight. Some said he ran away because of debts. Others that it was because of a scandal with 2 young ladies, said, lowering his voice mischievously. One of them was Diana. The other, Frances Ashcombe. Well, what a story, Miss Marple commented in a light tone, as if commenting on the weather. Webb nodded. Mrs. Forsyte never spoke of him again. It was as if he'd been erased. And Miss Ashcombe, well, she left soon after, Miss Marple thanked, him and left the shop, leaving the tailor with more questions than answers. As she walked home, she could feel the story taking shape in her mind. A broken engagement, a disappearance, 2 feuding friends, and a box that Crabtree claimed belonged to Francis. What had Diana kept for so many years? A letter? A confession? Evidence? When he got home, he found an envelope with no return address in his mailbox. Inside, a neatly folded piece of paper. I should have left everything buried. Some secrets just shouldn't be dug up, not even by you, Miss Marple. There was no signature, just a threat wrapped in politeness. Miss Marple, unperturbed, folded the note and put it in her sewing box. Then she lit the lamp and sat down by the window. Outside, night was falling, and with it, the masks. Whoever wrote that note wasn't afraid of being discovered yet. But he would be. Because in small towns, no matter how hard you try to bury the past, there's always someone who remembers the name everyone else has forgotten. Chapter 6. The Portrait in the Attic. The attic of Linton House had always been a forgotten place, as if cobwebs and dust had been part of the furnishings since time immemorial. No one visited it often, except for Turner, the gardener, when he went up to look for Christmas decorations or some old piece of furniture to repair. But that morning it was Lionel Forsyte who ventured up the narrow stairs, driven by a sudden restlessness. He didn't know exactly why he did it. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe a vague memory, a phrase Diana had said many years ago. Some things should stay where we left them, Lionel. Never flutter around in the past like a moth without judgment. The attic was freezing. The air smelled of damp wood and aged leather. At first, he found nothing of note. Antique hat boxes, a broken chair, rolled-up rugs and trunks strapped shut with iron straps. But it was behind a cupboard covered with a dusty blanket that he saw it. A painting. It was a portrait. The oil painting had lost some of its colour, but the figure remained vivid in its expression. A young man with dark hair and intense eyes, dressed in a grey period suit. The signature in the lower corner was barely visible at F.A. 1926. Lionel froze. He wasn't an artist, but he recognized the expression on her face. It was the same face he'd seen years ago, in a photograph Diana kept, one she said she never wanted to show. In the same corner, covered by a yellowish sheet, he found something else. A wooden box with a worn clasp. It wasn't the box that had disappeared from the study, but it looked similar. This one, however, wasn't locked. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. The paper was folded neatly, as if its contents should remain intact even longer than the container that held it. It began in firm handwriting. Dear Diana, if you ever decide to look at this, you will know that it was never your fault, that what happened that night was my decision. I am leaving not out of cowardice, but because this place can no longer hold the 3 of us without destroying us. Lionel didn't read any more. He immediately put the letter away and closed the box, as if he feared the past might escape from it in the form of a ghost. Hours later, sitting in his office with an untouched glass of sherry, he decided not to tell Inspector Hargreaves about the discovery. Not yet. Not about the painting, not about the letter. Maybe tomorrow, he told himself, or next week, when things were clearer. But Miss Marple was not a woman to rely on voluntary confessions. That same afternoon, while having tea with Mrs. Withers, distant cousin of Diana's who had come to express her condolences with exaggerated sobriety, she asked a simple question. "Do you remember any portrait that hung in Linton House before the Forsytes' wedding?" Mrs. Withers frowned. "Oh, yes. There was a beautiful portrait in the lobby of a very handsome but mysterious young man. He didn't have a name. They just said he was an acquaintance." "And what happened to him?" "Diana took it down before she got married. She said it wasn't appropriate to keep pictures from times gone by, although many said it was painted by a friend of hers. Frances, I think her name was." Miss Marple smiled slightly and took another sip of tea. "It's interesting what we consider inappropriate, isn't it? Some keep letters, others portraits. But all of us, in the end, keep something." When Inspector Hargreaves came that evening to update her, Miss Marple greeted him cordially. "Inspector, have you considered that the candlestick may not have been just a weapon, but also a message? A message? What kind of message? A symbol? Something only the victim would understand. Something connected to the past." The inspector looked at her curiously. "Are you suggesting that Diana Forsyte knew who would kill her?" "I'm suggesting that she recognized the candlestick, that its presence didn't surprise her. Perhaps it was a long-agreed-upon sign. Perhaps from someone who had disappeared." The silence stretched between them until the inspector said, "We found a button near the hedge, as I mentioned. It's antique mother-of-pearl. But no one has ever claimed clothing with that kind of button. What if it belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to be at the party? Someone who crashed not by mistake, but out of a desire for justice or revenge?" Hargreaves leaned forward. "Do you have someone in mind, Miss Marple?" She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the window, where the fog was beginning to cover the hedges like a blanket of secrets. "Not yet, Inspector. But portraits. Sometimes they look beyond the frame." And as night closed its circle over Little Witham, a solitary figure watched Linton House from a distance. His hat tilted to one side, his jacket buttoned to the neck, and one hand in his pocket, feeling for the absence of a stray button. Chapter 7. The Seamstress's Confession. Early the next day, rain fell on Little Witham with the timidity of a memory. The drops slid down the windows like thoughts that refused to leave, and the persistent mist made the streets seem narrower, the gardens quieter, and the secrets heavier. In her sewing room, Miss Marple knitted leisurely, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who has solved many puzzles, some with wool, others in silence. A letter from Inspector Hargreaves lay next to her tray of biscuits. "We found footprints at the base of the hedge, too small to belong to an adult male. Perhaps a woman, or someone wearing finer shoes. We still have no clear leads. Miss Marple had seen feet like that, and she knew that a woman who wanted to go unnoticed would choose the simplest, most forgettable thing: flat shoes, a dull fabric, a plain face." That same morning, she decided to visit Gladys Mott, the village seamstress. Her workshop was in one of the back alleys, a corner always scented with starch and button polish. Gladys, of small build and hair tied back in a tired bun, was a woman who observed more than she spoke. But she couldn't resist Miss Marple's presence, as if she feared that blue gaze might see between the seams of her soul. "I've come for a button," Miss Marple said as she entered, with a charming smile. "An antique one, mother of pearl, if you don't mind." Gladys blinked. "Oh, sure. Do you have a garment that needs repairing?" "No, just curious. I wonder if you've worked with that kind of button lately." Gladys hesitated. A slight tremor ran through her hands as she opened a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of buttons, but Miss Marple had already seen it. One was missing. The space was empty, but the thin outline of dust told me there had once been one there. "I heard," Miss Marple continued lightly, "that someone dropped one near the Forsyte hedge. Funny, isn't it? So many people moving through the bushes and nobody saw a thing." I don't know what to say," Gladys murmured without looking up. "Do you know, my dear, what's always fascinated me about your work?" Miss Marple asked, thoughtfully. "That seamstresses know all the secrets without question. Hems ripped from haste, rips in places no one would confess, stains hard to explain, and yet they mend everything without judgment." Gladys pursed her lips. It felt like an internal seam was about to burst. "I didn't mean to do it," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I just helped. Nothing more. I didn't think that it would go this far." Miss Marple nodded without surprise. "Who came to see her?" "A woman, but not from the village. She arrived a week ago. She asked me to adjust a long old coat, one of those they don't wear anymore. She wanted me to reinforce the buttons, the mother-of-pearl ones. Did he give a name? He just said he wouldn't stay long, that he came to deal with an old debt. I didn't understand what he meant. He paid me well. He didn't seem like a bad person, just tired." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Do you remember your hands?" Gladys frowned. Yes, her nails were manicured but unpolished. There was ink on her fingers, as if she wrote a lot, and an accent, not quite English. She looked like someone who'd lived abroad. The old woman stood up gently. "Thank you, Gladys. You haven't done anything wrong. Just a patch, like many others. But this patch was for someone who came to cut the past to shreds. When Miss Marple came out, the rain had stopped. She walked towards the church, where the garden was slowly clearing. Inspector Hargreaves was standing there, watching the wet gravel path. "A woman, then," he said, when Miss Marple shared what she knew. "A visitor. Anonymous. You know, that fits with a statement we received this morning. Mrs. Mildred says a boarder occupied the attic room in her boarding house for 3 nights. She never came down for breakfast. She paid in advance. She left yesterday at dawn." "Did he leave a name?" "Yes, Anne Fairley." Miss Marple stopped dead in her tracks. Fairley was Diana's maiden name. What if Anne was none other than Frances, using her former friend's name as a mask? The inspector nodded, his expression more serious than usual. It's her. She's back. But we still don't know if she's seeking justice or revenge." Miss Marple looked up at the sky, where the mist was slowly beginning to lift, gradually revealing the sharp outline of the church and the ancient tombstones. "We'll know, Inspector," he said, "because shadows can't hide forever when the light begins to shine." Chapter 8. The Name on the Forgotten Grave. Little Witham Cemetery, west of the village, was covered in a low mist that clung to the stone angels and marble crosses as if it knew the dead still held secrets. The paths between the graves were uneven, covered in ancient gravel and wildflowers no one had planted. There, between family mausoleums and moss-covered headstones, lay a forgotten section. Not abandoned, not quite, just overlooked. It was there that Miss Marple made her way that morning, accompanied by her curved-handled cane and a cloth bag containing a notebook, pencil, and lace handkerchief. It wasn't unusual to see her wandering through the corners of the cemetery. She said she did so to remember the names that time insists on erasing. But that day she was looking for one in particular. The name Fairley was not common in Little Witham. Although the family had lived there for generations, many branches had either left or merged with other surnames. Diana was one of the last visible bearers of the name. And yet, on a gravestone almost hidden beneath a wild vine, Miss Marple found what she was looking for. Francis M. Ashcombe, 1902, 1930. Everything he loved in silence. Miss Marple knelt with difficulty, pushed aside the leaves, and examined the engraving closely. A lily had been elaborately carved in the lower corner. The odd thing wasn't the date. It coincided with Francis's supposed disappearance. But what was missing? No mention of relatives, no exact date, no religious symbol. It was a hastily placed grave, as if someone wanted to be remembered, but not too much. A few minutes later, Inspector Hargreaves arrived, guided by a message sent by Miss Marple that very morning. His trench coat was slightly glistening with dew, and his face had that mixture of annoyance and anticipation that unscripted clues evoked. "What do we have here?" he asked when he saw the tombstone. "A name, a date, and a lie," Miss Marple replied, bluntly. "Francis Ashcombe didn't die in 1930. At least, not physically." "How do you know?" "Because he's here now, walking our streets under another name. It's not intuition, Inspector. It's emotional logic. No one sends threatening letters if he's buried." Hargreaves crossed his arms. "Let's assume you're right. Why would anyone want to fake their death? To disappear from view? To escape social judgment? Or to protect yourself? Maybe even to protect someone else?" They both remained silent for a few seconds, while the wind blew dry leaves between the tombstones. "And who ordered the tomb?" the inspector asked, looking around. "Because someone had to." Miss Marple pointed towards the north wall of the cemetery. "The parish register should say so. But I've already spoken to Mrs. Redley, the sexton's assistant. She confirmed that it was Diana who paid for this headstone." Hargreaves opened his eyes. She paid for the grave of a woman she never mentioned again?" "Exactly. As a form of mourning or penance. But the truly interesting thing isn't the grave, Inspector. It's the fact that no one has visited it in years. No one until this week. How do you know? Because the ground is disturbed. Look, someone moved the leaves recently. And that melted. Half-burned candle hasn't been here for more than 3 nights. Hargreaves leaned forward, looking at the small, still fragrant remnant of wax. A silent signal. A reunion with the dead, or with memories, Miss Marple added. "I bet you if we search Mrs. Mildred's boarding house, we'll still find traces of paraffin in the pockets of the lodger, Anne Fairley." The inspector nodded slowly. "So, do you think Francis came back to confront Diana?" "More than that. I think he came back to recover what was taken from him. Maybe a truth, maybe a confession. What if Diana refused? So, the candlestick was a message. Remember what you did." And the stolen box, it might have contained proof of that. A letter, perhaps. An emotional testament. The wind blew harder, and both figures stood before the tomb, as if waiting for an answer to spring from the marble. "There's still one piece missing, Inspector," Miss Marple said finally, as they started walking back. "The man you both loved, Charles Everleigh." "What about him? Some people believe he died. Others say he ran away. But I think he never went, as far as they said." The inspector looked at her cautiously. "Are you implying that Charles is still alive? What I'm suggesting is that in a story where everyone pretends to have forgotten, the real culprit may be the one everyone thought was lost." And as they walked back toward the village, a solitary figure watched from behind the cemetery wall, his hat tilted forward, an old scar above his left eyebrow, and a yellowed letter in the inside pocket of his coat. Chapter 9. The Letter Never Sent. That night the storm threatened to unleash its fury on Little Witham, but it held off, as if the sky itself were awaiting a revelation. The suspended clouds seemed to be closely watching what was happening. On earth, and in Mrs. Mildred's small boarding house, the silence was as thick as the darkness that filled the corridors. The attic room, recently vacated by the mysterious Anne Fairley, still smelled of lavender and old paper. It was Inspector Hargreaves who, after obtaining the necessary authorization, went upstairs with his flashlight and notebook, searching for any traces the anonymous guest might have left behind. The place was meticulous, with no obvious signs of haste. The bed was made, the mirror covered with a handkerchief, and the window was bolted. There were no suitcases, no forgotten clothes, just a single clue, an unreturned envelope hidden under the cushion of the window seat. She found it by chance as she sat down to examine the view outside. It was an unopened envelope, addressed, in slanted handwriting, "For those who still remember the truth." The inspector quickly went downstairs, but instead of heading to the police station, he took an instinctive detour to St. Mary Lane, where Miss Marple lived. He found her in her living room, sitting by the fire, silently knitting. Without needing to explain, she looked up as if she had been expecting him. "Anything new, Inspector?" he asked with almost complicit calm. "A letter. No clear addressee. But I think you should read it first." Miss Marple delicately took the envelope. She opened it without tearing it completely, as if the act of reading were also a form of resurrection. The letter, handwritten, unsigned and undated, read as follows: "When I left, I thought the pain would be behind me. But you don't escape what you haven't fully understood. Diana took from me the only thing I ever wanted without ambition. Not Charles. He was just the vehicle. What she took from me was the chance to be heard. I was painted as a traitor, buried, alive in a story I didn't write. I only wanted justice. This letter isn't a threat. It's a warning. Silences kill more slowly, but they kill just the same. If you're reading this, it means I didn't know how to forgive, or that Diana didn't want to repent. Both paths lead to the same end." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a few seconds. Then she placed the letter on her lap. "It's not a confession," he murmured, "but it's not an exoneration either. It's a wound that's still open, written in the ink of a past no one wanted to erase." Do you think Francis wrote it? No doubt. The voice of someone who has loved and hated the same person. Someone who has returned not to kill, but to be heard. The crime, Inspector. It may not have been premeditated. It may not even have been intentional. Hargreaves frowned. An accident. No, Miss Marple corrected gently. An impulse. A confrontation. A truth that dawns too late. Perhaps Diana tried to cling to that past she always controlled. And someone, tired of being a shadow, reacted. The inspector nodded slowly. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the complete picture was still missing. And what about Charles Everleigh? Miss Marple stood up and walked to the window. The town was asleep, but its rooftops seemed to whisper ancient stories. When she spoke, she did so without turning around. I've thought about it, about what a man like Charles represents to two such different women. Diana, proud, used to making decisions. Frances, sensitive, but not weak. Something happened between the three of them. A mistake. A betrayal. Maybe he wasn't a victim, but the source of the conflict. And you think he's back? I think so, and I think we've already seen it. Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. Where? At Diana's funeral. There was a man in the crowd. No one knew him. He wore a hat, a long coat, and avoided all contact. He seemed uncomfortable with death, not grieved, more like caught between duty and shame. The inspector seemed to remember. Tall, thin, scar over his left eyebrow. Exactly. That scar isn't from a war, Inspector. It's from a fight. Maybe with someone who loved him. They both remained silent. The fire crackled, as if celebrating the progress of reasoning. Finally, Miss Marple spoke again. Charles never died. He hid. From his guilt, from his actions. Perhaps Diana protected him. Perhaps they both decided that Frances shouldn't tell the story. The missing box. It contained letters for sure. Proof that Charles was still alive. Frances only came to reclaim her truth. And he found her. Yes, although perhaps not as I expected. Hargreaves took the letter, put it in his coat, and bowed in respect. Thank you, Miss Marple. As always, you look beyond the obvious. She smiled faintly, but her eyes didn't soften. Oh, Inspector, the obvious is a place where the truth hides better than in any shadow. Chapter 10. The Identity of the Man in the Hat. In Little Witham, strangers were like dead leaves. They never went unnoticed. A different hat, or a quicker gait, was enough for the invisible eyes of the town to follow them with a mixture of discretion and judgment. That's why the man who appeared at Diana Forsyte's funeral, dressed in a dark coat and a tilted hat, had aroused curiosity. But, as in any community that prides itself on minding what doesn't concern it, even though it does all the time, no one openly asked about him. Nobody, except Miss Marple. During the morning, the old woman strolled around the village with a clear objective, though she pretended to shop windows. She spoke briefly with Mrs. Redley at the flower shop, exchanged words with the postman at the mill corner, and stopped in front of Mr. Larch's antique shop, where more secrets were discussed than watches were sold. Do you remember Mr. Larch, that gentleman who attended the funeral wearing a grey hat? He asked, fondling a cracked music box. Of course, Miss Marple. He had the look of someone who has been avoiding mirrors for years. He bought an antique pipe. He said he used to smoke one like it when everything was simpler. Did you pay by card? No, cash. But he asked if he could leave a letter. He said someone would come and pick it up. Miss Marple sat up with interest. "Can I see her?" The antique dealer hesitated only a second. With a shrug, he pulled out a small letter wrapped in brown paper, tied with a thin thread. "It has no return address, but it's addressed to M.A., he said. Marple took it in his hands. M.A. Miss Anne? Miss Ashcombe? And has anyone claimed it? No one yet. Then let me keep it, Mr. Larch. Not out of intrigue, but out of prevention." The man nodded, and Miss Marple walked off with the letter in her bag, unopened. Not yet. The time would come. Meanwhile, Inspector Hargreaves had sent one of his officers to check the guest registers of the neighbouring inns. It was in the Fox and Fiddle, a discreet establishment on the outskirts of town, where they discovered the name Michael Arden, registered 4 days ago, missing 2 days ago, and his physical description: tall, grey hair, scar over his left eyebrow. Charles Everley had returned under a new name, but his face, it seemed, still told the true story. That afternoon, Hargreaves showed up at Miss Marple's house with his findings. She welcomed him into her living room, where tea was already steaming, and a small box of freshly baked shortbread sat on a tray. "Michael Arden," Miss Marple repeated, sounding almost wistful. What a carefully chosen name. The initials match those of Charles Everley. Coincidence? I doubt it. "We have his signature on the record," the inspector said. "If we could find an old letter written by Charles, we could compare it." "No need. He left this one," Miss Marple replied, holding up the thread-wrapped letter. They opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten Francis. "I didn't come back because I was afraid. Not of the scandal or of Diana. Of you. Of what I'd done to you. I thought silence was forgiveness. Now I understand it was abandonment. You read this, I'll be in the old garden at the Linton Ruins. I have nothing more to give you. Only the truth and my last days." Hargreaves exhaled slowly. So, he planned it all. He came back. He waited. And maybe it wasn't him who killed. "Diana," Miss Marple said, narrowing her eyes. Maybe it was Diana who confronted him in anger with a final need for control. And in that clash, something broke. And Francis? Francis came to see if there was any justice left. But perhaps she arrived too late, or too early. That same evening, the inspector and Miss Marple walked together to the ruins of Linton House, where an overgrown garden had swallowed up the story of a family torn apart by pride and betrayal. Sitting on a lichen-covered bench, his hat in his lap, and his gaze fixed on a point beyond the present, Charles Everley was waiting for them. He didn't run away. He didn't lie. He just said, "I thought the past could be sealed like an unsent letter, but some truths keep leaking out." Miss Marple, her voice barely lower than the wind, asked him, "Did you hit her?" He shook his head. "We argued. Diana told me she'd burned all the letters, that Francis wouldn't come back, that I'd have to leave a second time. She lunged for the box and tripped. I didn't push her, but I didn't save her either." The inspector listened in silence. Then he said, "You'll have to come with us, not for murder, but for what comes next." Charles nodded. "I understand. Sometimes punishment isn't a prison cell. It's memory." Miss Marple watched him as he was led away. Not with judgment. With the quiet sadness of someone who has often seen how love without humility, turns to ruin. Chapter 11. The Secret the Box Kept. The box appeared 3 days after Charles Everleigh's arrest. It was found by pure chance, although Miss Marple knew very well that nothing in Little Witham was really casual. Young Alec Crumble, the baker's son, was chasing his mischievous cat around the Forsytes' greenhouse when he tripped over a floorboard that creaked in a distinct way. Curious and somewhat nosy, like all well-bred village children, he picked it up. There, amid the dampness and dust, lay the missing wooden box. Its hinges were rusty, and its clasp was loose, but it was still intact. When it was handed to Inspector Hargreaves, he didn't open it immediately. He chose to take it himself to St. Othith, Mary Lane, where Miss Marple was waiting for him with her usual quiet dignity and a freshly poured teapot. "Have you opened it yet?" she asked, indicating the box with a slight gesture. "No. It seemed right to do it in your presence." She nodded, took her glasses from the embroidered case, and they both sat down at the table as if solving a garden puzzle. Hargreaves lifted the lid. The inside smelled of dried lavender, old paper, and something else, a faint fragrance, perhaps of ink or memories. The first thing they saw was a neat stack of letters. Pale satin ribbons held them together with the neatness of someone who guards not just words, but emotions that shouldn't be mixed. Some were addressed to Diana, others to Francis. The handwriting was recognizably that of Charles Everleigh. Civ. Marple picked one at random and read in a low voice. "I can't decide who I've betrayed more. You, who waited for me, or her, who controlled me. Perhaps the worst part is that I no longer recognize myself in either version. The man I loved, the man I obeyed, both are dead. A sentimental confession," she said, delicately laying the letter down. "Written not to provoke, but to preserve a story no one wanted to tell." Beneath the letters was a sepia photograph, the three of them together at a picnic long before the wounds began. Diana with a parasol, Francis with a shy smile, Charles between them, like a hyphen between two names. On the back, someone had written, "Summer of 1927. Everything seemed to last forever." And finally, at the bottom of the box, a thick, unopened envelope. It had no address, but a single word in large letters. Testament. Hargreaves opened it cautiously. Inside was a handwritten document, in the same elegant style as Diana Forsyte. It was dated just 6 months earlier. Miss Marple read in a low voice, "I, Diana Mary Forsyte, being of sound mind, declare that, in the event of my death, all property and contents of Linton House will be donated to the Chichester Women's Refugee Foundation, with one exception, the box of letters, which is to be given to Frances M. Ashcombe, if she is living. Otherwise, it is to be destroyed unread." The old woman let out a sigh. She knew Francis could come back. She knew this past wasn't dead, just dormant. "And you still kept the box?" the inspector asked. Because part of her wanted the truth to come out. Maybe not enough to seek it out, but enough to not hide it completely. It was her way of asking for forgiveness without admitting it out loud. Hargreaves nodded silently. Part of him still wished he could find more tangible, more conclusive evidence. But in crimes of the heart, the concrete is rarely the most revealing. Do you think Frances will read these letters if she's still around?" Miss Marple looked out the window. Outside, the daffodils were beginning to droop under the weight of the rain. Frances has already read what she needed to. The letter in the shop, the tombstone, Diana's silence. Everything has spoken to her. But I don't know if she'll go back for the box. Some truths, Inspector, once acknowledged, no longer need reliving. That afternoon, the box was sealed and taken to the police station, awaiting the will's decision. Charles Everleigh, still in custody, had lapsed into an almost apathetic state. He confessed to the encounter, reaffirming that he hadn't pushed Diana, but offered no defence. He seemed more willing to be judged by age than by the law, and Frances Ashcombe was never seen again. Her room was rented by another guest. Mrs. Mildred commented that the woman left with little luggage, but with a lighter look on her face than when she arrived. Miss Marple, in her garden, trimmed the withered branches of her favourite rosebush with scissors. As she did so, she murmured, "Some wounds aren't healed with justice, but with understanding, and others are simply wither away in silence." Chapter 12. Return to the Porch. It was a spring afternoon when little Witham, with its usual discretion, attempted to return to normal. The breeze smelled of rosemary and damp earth, and the song of the blackbirds above the cemetery hedges seemed to have regained its carefree tone. But Diana Forsyte's death still hung like a long shadow, especially in the conversations that were interrupted by the sight of someone passing by on the street. Linton House remained closed, awaiting the final settlement of the will. The flowers in the garden, without Turner's care, grew tangled, as if trying to cover up the secrets brewing along its paths. Just once more, the porch would welcome visitors, not for a party, but to close a cycle. Miss Marple, informally invited by Inspector Hargreaves, returned to the crime scene for the last time. The police had concluded their formal investigation. No murder charges would be filed. The official cause was an accidental fall during a domestic disturbance. But there were still details to be clarified, details that only she seemed to consider essential. The inspector met her next to the porch, where the sun tinged the old wood gold, and the air smelled once again of dahlias. "I thought it would be appropriate for you to be here," he said bluntly. "After all, this started with a party and a candelabra, and it ends with an understanding," Miss Marple replied, looking at the place where the object had been found, now recovered and in the hands of the police. Hargreaves nodded. "Charles Everleigh has agreed to testify. Frances Ashcombe has vanished without a trace, just as she did the first time," said Miss Marple, "but this time by choice, not by compulsion, which, for a woman of her character, is a form of justice." They both entered the now empty house. The echo of their footsteps was louder than ever. Upon reaching the living room, Miss Marple stopped in front of the mantelpiece, where the box had once rested. "May I?" he asked, pointing to a chair. "Of course," Hargreaves said, settling in front of her. Miss Marple laced her fingers in her lap. Her voice was calm, clear, as if she were weaving a blanket of words. Diana Forsyte was murdered, not by a blow, but by her own character. Controlling, possessive, unable to tolerate her version of the story being questioned. Charles returned with intentions of reconciliation, not love, but redemption. But Diana couldn't accept that. She possessed him, or thought she did. When she saw his control unravelling, that Charles and perhaps even Francis were coming full circle without her, she reacted. And in that reaction, the inevitable happened. Hargreaves said, "Yes, he fell. It was an accident, but one built on years of pride, resentment, and denial." There was a silence. Then the inspector asked, "And the box?" It was her penance. Diana kept her not out of affection, but out of power. Having her allowed her to define the narrative. If Francis appeared, Diana could still decide what to reveal. But the letters were there. Charles wrote them years ago. They were probably never read. Because Diana preferred control to the truth. And Francis? She wasn't seeking revenge, Inspector. She just wanted to be heard. When she saw Charles facing his guilt, she understood that justice isn't always wrought with judgment, but with actions. She didn't need the law's forgiveness. She just needed to look into Charles's eyes and know that he at last understood. Hargreaves leaned back in his chair. For the first time in days, his expression was less tense. There's something reassuring about the fact that this wasn't just a crime of passion. Because it wasn't, Miss Marple said with a slight smile. It was an emotional crime, a story without complete redemption, but with a truth that emerged despite the silence. She stood up gently, smoothing her skirt. "Did you know, Inspector, that porches reveal more than they conceal? All greetings and farewells pass through them, and secrets usually stay in their corners. They both left the house." The evening light fell on the steps like a final curtain. As Hargreaves closed the door, Miss Marple paused for a moment at the edge of the porch. "I wonder," she said, more to herself than to him, "if Diana ever imagined she would die right here, where she so often controlled who came and went." The inspector silently escorted her to the gate. The village awaited them on the other side. The same place, different now. It had changed, not with noise, but with what little Witham had always feared most, the truth spoken in hushed tones. And Miss Marple, with a serene step, returned to her garden, where the rose bushes bloomed without asking permission. She wrote no report, claimed no credit. She simply resumed her knitting, as if each stitch also revealed a new story.